Welcome back to Study Hall. We're diving deep today, folks, really deep, into the Born Alive Abortion Survivors Protection Act.
Oh yeah, this one's a big one.
It really is. I mean,
Right.
talk about something with some serious implications for, well, everyone involved. Healthcare practitioners, parents, the legal system, you name it.
Absolutely. This act, it kind of sits right at the intersection of a bunch of really sensitive areas.
It does. So before we get into all that, let's just lay out the basics here. What does this act even aim to do?
Well, in the simplest terms, it requires healthcare providers to give the same care to infants born alive after an attempted abortion as they would to any other baby.
Okay, so same level of care, regardless of how the birth happened.
Right, same gestational age, same care.
Makes sense, on the surface at least. But I imagine it gets a lot more complicated when you start getting into the details.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, right off the bat, what does born alive even mean in this context? And what are the specific obligations of the practitioners?
Yeah, good point. So let's start with born alive. How does the Act define that?
It actually pulls the definition straight from the Born Alive Infants Protection Act, which says an infant is born alive if they show any sign of life after being completely expelled or extracted from the mother.
So any sign of life, like breathing.
Breathing, heartbeat, even just a little flicker of voluntary muscle movement.
Wow, so it's not just about breathing on their own, it's any indication of life at all.
Exactly. Any of those signs triggers these obligations for healthcare providers.
Obligations, yeah. Let's talk about those. What are they required to do if an infant is born alive after an abortion?
Well, the Act is very clear. They have to provide the same level of care that any other infant born at the same gestational age would get.
So treat them like any other patient, basically.
Basically, yeah. But, ethically and emotionally, I'm sure that gets really complicated really fast.
Oh, I bet. Imagine being a healthcare provider in that situation.
It'd be a lot to process. And it's not just about providing care in that moment either. The Act also requires something else.
Oh, okay. What else does it say?
It requires immediate transportation and admission of the infant to a hospital. No exceptions.
Wow, no exceptions. That's pretty serious.
Yeah, it really emphasizes how serious this is. And the Act also outlines some pretty significant consequences for not complying with these requirements.
Okay, let's talk about those consequences. What are we talking about here?
Well, for healthcare practitioners who don't provide the required care or transport the infant, they could be looking at fines.
Fines, okay.
Imprisonment for up to 5 years.
5 years.
Or both.
Wow. So it's not messing around.
Not at all. And there's also the possibility of prosecution under existing homicide laws.
So you're saying if someone intentionally ends the life of a child born alive after an abortion, that could be considered homicide?
Potentially, yes. It's getting into some serious legal territory there.
It is. So we've got potential fines, imprisonment, even homicide charges. Are there any other legal ramifications?
Yes, actually. The Act also allows for civil action.
Civil action. What does that mean in this context?
It means the woman who had the abortion could sue for damages.
Damages, like what kind of damages?
Things like, physical or psychological injuries.
So she could sue the healthcare providers involved if they didn't follow the Act.
Exactly. And those damages can be substantial, too. We're talking about what are called statutory damages.
That's statutory damages, huh?
Which in this case are 3 times the cost of the abortion. And then on top of that, there's also the possibility of punitive damages.
3 times the cost of the abortion. That's a lot. So it sounds like lawmakers really wanted to make sure this act had some teeth.
It certainly seems that way. Those financial implications alone could be huge.
Yeah, no kidding. And all of this applies to everyone involved except the mother, right? You mentioned an exemption.
Right. There's one key exemption. The mother herself can't be prosecuted under this law.
So all the legal weight falls on the healthcare practitioners.
It does. It's a lot of pressure on them.
It is. And it makes you wonder, how do supporters of this act even justify it constitutionally?
Yeah.
Especially with everything surrounding abortion rights these days.
Well, they mainly rely on a couple of arguments based in the Constitution.
Okay, what are they?
First, they point to Section 5 of the 14th Amendment.
The 14th Amendment, the one about equal protection under the law.
Exactly. They argue that infants born alive after an abortion deserve the same protections as any other infant. Denying them care would violate that right.
That's interesting. So what's the second argument?
The second one uses Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution, specifically the necessary and proper clause.
Okay, and how does that fit in?
They believe Congress has the authority to create laws necessary to carry out its other powers. And they see this act as necessary to enforce that equal protection guarantee from the 14th Amendment.
I see. So they're essentially saying this act is needed to uphold the Constitution.
That's their argument. And they also bring in the Commerce Clause to support their position.
The Commerce Clause, what does that have to do with this?
Well, the Commerce Clause gives Congress the power to regulate commerce among the states. And they argue that because abortion services can involve interstate commerce, Congress has the power to regulate them.
So they're using multiple parts of the Constitution to justify this act.
They are. It really highlights how this legislation intersects with some pretty fundamental legal principles.
It does. And it's clearly a complex and controversial issue, touching on some really big questions about the beginning of life, individual rights, and the government's role in healthcare.
It touches on everything. And speaking of complex, we can't forget about the ethical considerations here. This act really puts healthcare providers in a difficult position.
For sure. It's not just about following the law. It's about navigating some really personal and ethical aspects of patient care.
Exactly. There's so much to consider here, and we're just getting started.
Yeah, this is definitely a deep dive. We've laid out the basics of the Born Alive Abortion Survivors Protection Act, what it says, what it requires, the legal and constitutional basis for it. But there's a lot more to explore.
Oh, definitely. A lot more.
And we're back with Study Hall, continuing our deep dive into the Born Alive Abortion Survivors Protection Act. Last time we laid out the basics, the what and the how of the act itself. Now, things get really interesting. We're going to tackle the arguments for and against this pretty controversial piece of legislation.
You got it. And trust me, there are strong opinions on both sides. To really understand this, we've got to understand those viewpoints.
Absolutely. So let's start with the supporters. What are some of the main arguments they're making in favor of this act?
Well, one of the big ones centers around the moral status of an infant born alive, regardless of the circumstances of the birth.
So they're saying once that baby is born, it doesn't matter how they got there, they deserve the same rights and protections as anyone else.
Exactly. For a lot of supporters, ending the life of a baby who's been born alive is, well, it's morally the same as infanticide. And they see this act as essential to preventing that.
So it's about making sure those infants have legal protection they feel might be missing right now.
Right. They see it as filling a gap in the legal system, offering specific safeguards for these really vulnerable infants.
Makes sense.
Yeah.
And beyond the moral argument, I know supporters also talk about the impact this can have on healthcare providers, right?
Oh, yeah. They acknowledge that, being there, seeing a child born alive after an abortion, it can be incredibly traumatic, even for people who support abortion rights in general.
Right, of course.
And they believe that by making sure those infants get care, it can actually help alleviate some of that trauma for the healthcare providers involved.
Interesting. So it's about protecting the infants and the healthcare professionals who, find themselves in that really tough situation.
Exactly. It's a complicated situation all around. But now let's flip the script. Let's look at the other side, the folks who oppose this act.
Yeah, because they have some strong concerns as well. What are some of the main arguments against the Born Alive Abortion Survivors Protection Act?
One of the biggest concerns you hear is that this act interferes with the doctor-patient relationship. They see it as the government getting in the way of private medical decisions.
So it's about autonomy, letting the healthcare provider and the patient make decisions based on their specific situation without outside interference.
Right. They argue that these situations are so complex, medically, ethically, it's a lot. They need to be able to provide individualized care.
And they're worried this act might prevent that.
Yeah, they feel like it ties their hands, like they won't be able to do what they think is truly best for the patient.
That's a tough spot to be in, for sure.
It is. And then there are the worries about unintended consequences. Could these strict requirements actually end up causing more harm than good?
Right. Forcing interventions that wouldn't have been necessary otherwise.
Exactly. It's a valid concern. And there's another argument against the act that we hear a lot. It's the idea that this whole thing is based on a false premise.
A false premise? What do you mean?
Well, they're saying that infants surviving abortion procedures, it's incredibly rare, and existing laws already protect them.
So they're basically saying this act is trying to solve a problem that doesn't exist.
That's their view, yeah. They see it as more about politics than an actual medical need.
Okay, I see. And I imagine opponents are also concerned about the impact this could have on abortion access as a whole.
Oh, absolutely. That's a big one. They worry that this act will make providers hesitant to perform abortions, even in cases where it's medically necessary,
Yeah.
because they're afraid of legal trouble.
Right, so it becomes a barrier to safe and legal abortion,
It's it.
adding another layer of complexity and risk.
Exactly. It's not an easy situation. It's clear that both sides feel very strongly about the Born Alive Abortion Survivors Protection Act.
Yeah, and it's clear that there's no easy answer here. Both sides have valid points, and this is definitely not a black and white issue.
It really isn't. I think it's challenging because it forces us to think about some really fundamental questions, about life, death, the role of government, when does life begin, what about personal health care decisions?
Big questions.
Huge. It really gets to the core of who we are as individuals and as a society.
It does, and it's important to remember, in the middle of all this, these are real people we're talking about. People with their own beliefs, their own experiences.
Absolutely. Regardless of where you stand on this act, approaching it with empathy and understanding, that's crucial. These are sensitive issues, complex matters. We need to treat them with care, have respectful dialogue.
Okay, so we've looked at the arguments for and against the act, recognizing that there are valid points on both sides. But now let's shift gears a little. What about the potential impact of this act? How might it actually shape the future of abortion law and healthcare in the U.S.?
That's the question, isn't it? It's a question a lot of people are asking. Legal scholars, healthcare professionals, policymakers, they're all trying to figure it out.
It's a big deal. The ripple effects could be significant.
They could be. And trying to predict exactly how things will play out, it's not easy. But let's think about some of the potential scenarios.
Okay, what might we see happen as a result of this act?
Well, one possibility is that this act could embolden other states to pass similar laws, especially in states that are already, moving towards stricter abortion laws.
We've definitely seen that trend in recent years, so it wouldn't be surprising to see them using this act as a model.
Right. And that could lead to a wave of similar laws, where access to abortion varies drastically from state to state.
Yeah, a real patchwork system, where it's wide open in some places, but almost impossible in others.
That's a real concern. And it could be really confusing, even dangerous for women trying to get the health care they need.
Definitely. What else? What other potential scenarios are we looking at?
Well, it's highly likely this act will be challenged in court. And it could even end up before the Supreme Court.
Oh, wow. Given how the court is made up right now, that could be a game changer for abortion rights everywhere.
Absolutely. The Supreme Court has a history of shaping abortion law in this country. So a ruling on this act could have huge consequences. We could even see Roe v. Wade impacted.
Yeah, it could weaken Roe v. Wade even further, opening the door for even more restrictions on abortion access nationwide.
Right. But on the flip side, if the act gets struck down, that could embolden abortion rights advocates. They might challenge some of the restrictive laws that are already out there.
So it's a real back and forth. The legal battles, the politics, it's all tied together in this fight over abortion rights.
It is. And the outcome of that fight will have a real impact on a lot of people's lives.
It's a reminder that laws have consequences and that this isn't just some abstract debate. This is about real people, their health care, their choices, their rights.
Their lives. And whether you support this act or not, I think it's so important to approach this with sensitivity and respect, to be willing to listen to different points of view.
Because this isn't black and white. There are valid concerns on both sides, and they're rooted in deeply held beliefs.
Right. And we need to have those honest conversations, even when they're hard. We have to acknowledge those deeply held beliefs on both sides, because ultimately, this is about people, healthcare providers, parents, and the infants at the heart of all of this.
And we're back for the final part of our deep dive on the Born Alive Abortion Survivors Protection Act here on Study Hall. We've been talking a lot about the act itself, the arguments for and against it, the potential impact it could have.
Lots to unpack.
It really is. And before we wrap things up, there's one more piece we need to look at. How this act actually defines abortion.
Oh, yeah, that's important. The definition really sets the stage for understanding the scope of the act.
Exactly. So let's get right into it. What does the act say about what constitutes an abortion?
Well, it defines abortion as using any instrument, medicine, drug, or device to kill the unborn child or terminate the pregnancy.
Okay, so any intentional act to end a pregnancy or the life of the fetus falls under that definition? Seems pretty straightforward.
It does, but there's a little more to it.
Okay, what am I missing?
The definition also has this phrase, with an intention other than, And then it lists two specific exceptions.
All right, so what are those exceptions, and how do they change things?
The first one is after viability to produce a live birth and preserve the life and health of the child born alive.
So if the goal is to deliver a living baby, even if it's, after a certain point in the pregnancy, it wouldn't be considered an abortion.
Exactly. So like if a late-term abortion was necessary, maybe because of really severe fetal abnormalities or a danger to the mother's life, but the intention was to save the baby, that wouldn't be considered an abortion under this act.
Gotcha. So it acknowledges that there are situations where ending a pregnancy isn't about, ending the life of the fetus. Okay, so what's the other exception?
The other one is to remove a dead unborn child. So if a fetus has already died, procedures to remove it wouldn't fall under this act's definition of abortion.
So really, the act is specifically focused on those cases where a fetus is alive at the time of the procedure and a live birth actually happens.
That's right. It's not about regulating all pregnancy terminations. It's specifically addressing those situations where an infant is born alive after an attempted abortion. And then the question becomes, what care needs to be provided?
Right, right. That distinction is really important to keep in mind. It helps to understand the scope of the act. It's not about broadly restricting abortion. It's a much more specific focus.
It is. And it highlights how important it is to use really precise language when talking about this. Words have a lot of power, especially when we're dealing with something this sensitive and legally complex.
Absolutely. So we've talked about the act in detail, what it says, what it means, the arguments surrounding it. As we wrap things up here, what are the key takeaways for our listeners? What should they be thinking about as they engage with this issue going forward?
Well, I think a big takeaway is that this whole debate really reflects a fundamental tension in our society, that tension between the rights of the pregnant woman and the perceived rights of the fetus. It's like this balancing act, and it has huge implications, ethically, legally, societally.
It's a balancing act we're still trying to figure out as a society. And this act just kind of throws those tensions into the spotlight.
It does. And finding that balance, it's not easy. It takes a lot of careful consideration. We have to think about different values, respect different viewpoints, and really be willing to talk about these things, even when it's hard.
Yeah, open dialogue is so important. It's easy to just stick to your own side, your own opinions. But to really understand this, you have to listen to engage with people who think differently than you.
Absolutely. And I'd also encourage listeners to think about the consequences of this act. The intended consequences, sure, but also the unintended ones. What might happen to access to abortion care? What about the relationship between doctors and patients? What does this mean for the future of reproductive rights? These are questions we all need to be asking ourselves.
It's about thinking beyond the headlines, the political talking points, and looking at the real impact this could have, the real impact on real people.
Right. And this is where it gets personal, too. What are your beliefs? What are your values? What do you think about this act? What do you think about the abortion debate as a whole? Taking the time to really think about your own perspective, that can help you understand this whole thing in a much deeper way.
It's about connecting with the human side of all of this. These aren't just abstract debates. They affect real people, real families all across the country.
Exactly. It all comes back to people, the healthcare providers, the parents, and especially those infants who are, at the center of all of this. We should be looking for solutions that protect those who are vulnerable while also respecting everyone's rights and making sure everyone has access to safe, compassionate healthcare.
That's a great point to end on. This has been a really deep dive into a complicated topic. Thanks for joining us on Study Hall as we examine the Born Alive Abortion Survivors Protection Act.
Thanks for having me. Always happy to tackle these tough issues.
And thank you to our listeners for sticking with us. We'll see you next time as we continue exploring the world of law and healthcare.